Okay, what it is, guys? It's your boy AK Rex here, and welcome back to the channel. I have brought you a special guest today, who, if you are new to the channel, you haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Carr.
Good morning and Happy New Year. Thanks for having me back.
Happy New Year to you too, Dr. Carr, and thank you very much. For me, it's 5:30 in the evening, and for you, I guess it is good morning indeed because of the time difference. So, for those who are not aware, we are based in completely different parts of the world, so made quite a lot of effort to make this happen. And the reason why we came here, and by the way, before I actually get into reasons why we came here, please make sure you are caught up with the previous session that we had before. It's approximately sometime in November, but I will leave the link in the description box below. So the reason why we are here is to discuss something that doesn't get discussed very frequently, and I believe it's an important and informative subject for those who want to get into paleontology and better understand how certain things are done in paleontology and what to look out for. And today's subject of this section will be the ethics statement, which summarizes the main statement of ethical codes, so to speak, of SVP. Am I correct, Dr. Carr? Is that what you would say it is, basically?
Yep, yeah. The Society of Vertebrate Paleontology is the professional organization that represents the science of vertebrate paleontology internationally. And as members, there's a certain code of ethics that we follow, and those can be seen online. They aren't kept secret at all. They're online at vertpaleo.org, and they have several sections that vertebrate paleontologists and students, members of the society, are expected to follow. And they're there to protect the integrity of the science at the end of the day. That's the purpose.
Okay, I see. So, for those of you who are watching the video, you should obviously use the link in the description box below if you want to follow us sort of step by step. We're not going to obviously do like a law degree class here, but we are just going to go briefly over some of the section points. So if you guys who are viewing the video right now, please open up the link in the description, and you can have a easier time to track what we are talking about. So we is there any particular section, Dr. Card, you would like to address, or would you want to just address them all one by one briefly? What's your preference on this matter?
Well, I guess we could. Guess we could start. I could just describe the general issue that vertebrate paleontology faces, given the popularity of dinosaurs with people around the world. There's also a market for fossils, including dinosaur fossils. And what that market does, when fossils are sold to private individuals, those fossils are actually out of reach of the science. We can't study those, and that is part of the ethics of the science, is that we only study fossils that are in museums, and that is in section 4, deposition of fossil specimens. It says scientifically significant fossil vertebrate specimens along with ancillary data should be curated and accessioned into collections of repositories charged in perpetuity with conserving fossil vertebrates for scientific study and education. So these include, for example, accredited museums, universities, colleges, and other educational institutions. And the reason for that criterion is that observations can be verified. So, for example, the type specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex is in the collections of the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and there it will stay for all time, as long as civilization lasts. And what that guarantees is that any observation made by, say, Henry Fairfield Osborn back in 1905 or 1916, or by myself in more recent time, or other paleontologists, any observation we make, any other scientist can go and verify at the Carnegie Museum. That specimen is not going anywhere. It is going to stay there. The problem with, and so the issue comes when specimens are privately owned. And so say somebody purchases a T.rex, or a company purchases a T.rex, and it goes in their lobby, or or someplace like that. The person owning it doesn't qualify as an accredited museum or a college. In other words, a permanent repository. And so what that means is there's no guarantee that a specimen will be there, say, in 50, 100 years from now. A specimen in private hands might change hands, or might, no one knows. There's no guarantee of what will happen to the specimen. Right? And so this ethic of regarding the deposition of fossil specimens in a valid collection, like an accredited museum like the American Museum of Natural History or the Carnegie Museum, places like that, guarantees that fossils will basically be in a fossil library that will be accessible to science for all time.
Sure. So basically, if I were to draw the correct conclusion from what you have presented, is that one of the main aspects of science is not only to be able to produce initial claim, it's also to be able to later, with later maybe advanced technologies as time goes by, and more people entering the field, to perhaps try to verify and further test those claims. And for this to be possible, they will have to have the access, a guaranteed access to the library of these fossils. And when you're talking about the privately owned specimens, that may not always be possible. And therefore, if any claim or any knowledge that was established before, even by the time it may become dated, given the nature of the ever-changing nature of paleontology, we will be facing a bit of a dilemma and kind of a crazy, vicious circle here. Am I correct with my conclusions?
Yeah, I think the issue is that if a fossil is in a private collection, it may be accessible one day, but it might not be accessible the next. And that issue just doesn't come into play with regard to, valid museum collections. And so it's just for us to do research and science is just hands off when it comes to privately owned specimens, simply because there isn't that long-term guarantee that the specimen will always be accessible for study. And that's central to the integrity of our science, and it's actually central to the integrity of all sciences, is that observations need to be repeatable. And in our particular case, our observations are based on fossils, on objects, and those objects need to be kept in a place where they're secure and that there's, access for science for all time.
Sure enough, and I once again, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but to also break it down a little bit for the viewers, basically this means that if you are to go into ever use any privately owned specimens as your source material, or to produce any sort of content to inform people, to educate people, this basically is not recommended to do. So always try to use the specimens that are directly a part of these accredited bodies which hold these collections, because quite frankly, sometimes I believe it might be possible potentially that when you have made certain observation and certain study for a privately owned specimen, And if you need to go back to it, sometimes you will only be able to verify this again and be 100% sure that your follow-up knowledge is correct if you go back to that same specimen. If the private owner were to change the terms, given that they are perfectly in control of that specimen and the terms, this could potentially, well, to speak frankly, mess up your research, and thus we are left in a black hole. Am I, once again, correct in my conclusions, Dr. Carr?
Yeah, in general, yes. And, certainly there are specimens that come to museums in various ways. Either you have a crew from a museum that goes out into fossil-bearing rocks and collects fossils, and those go back to a museum directly. There's some cases like Sue at the Field Museum that was initially collected by a commercial outfit, and then it was seized as evidence in a legal case, and then it was deemed to be private property of a rancher who put it up for auction. And luckily for science, the Field Museum had support from Disney and McDonald's, and they placed the winning bid on Sue. And so now Sue is part of the permanent collections of the Field Museum, and Sue is accessible to the public, to the public for the public to see, and also accessible to scientists. So, if I ever need to go and see Sue's skull for the work I'm currently doing, I can make arrangements to see it. And that's sort of the ideal situation, is that a specimen like that does wind up in a museum, in a valid, legitimate museum like the Field. In other cases, some specimens may be spectacular, but they don't always make it to a museum, and a couple examples come to mind. One is Samson, which is a very well-preserved T.rex that did go onto the market and unfortunately was sold to a private body. I don't know if it was an individual or not, but Samson basically has disappeared into the night of private ownership. In other cases, we have other specimens that do emerge into the public, such as Tristan, which is a very well-preserved T.rex. It's currently on display in Berlin. But that is a privately owned specimen. And it certainly isn't unethical to display such a specimen, but it would be unethical for me to actually gather data from that specimen and publish on it. That would go against Section 4, so the deposition of fossil specimens, as we discussed, is privately owned, so it's not accessioned into a museum. And so for me, as enticing as that specimen is, it's hands-off, because in terms of access to the specimen, that issue that we discussed, there's no guarantee that there would be access to it in perpetuity. And so for us, that's hands-off, and that comes back to this repeatability of observation criterion that's necessary for any science to flourish, and actually, flourish in the sense of building on previous knowledge and making new insights from new information.
Yeah, that's perfectly understandable, and I can sort of feel how much it can be frustrating, given the fact that, like you mentioned already, the specimen is quite well preserved, and there are certain unique features of it that could be observed, especially in its teeth layout. But once again, hands off, because we cannot come in there and study it just for those reasons that we have established, unfortunately. Now, my main question regarding Tristan and why, I think, again, this is purely just something to theorize about, but would it be possible in any way for by any kind of development of circumstances. Explain, basically, the reason why I'm asking is because one of the reasons I brought this up in general is because I am completely new to this particular aspect of paleontology, and so are probably my viewers. And so once again, there will be some questions that are very straightforward and easy, maybe sound easy for you and the colleagues, but they're not as straightforward for us. So would you be please kind to elaborate on whether or not it's possible to for any professional and accredited body like a museum or an institution to recover this specimen from the private hands?
So some museums do purchase fossils, and that does bring them into the public trust. So there's, there's no ethics being violated there. Just the question that arises in my mind is, are they keeping the fossil trade going? They're, since if fossils are being purchased, does that keep the commercial trade alive? And so, these things aren't cut and dry. It's sort of, in some ways, the science is sort of being held hostage a bit. Sort of these specimens are sort of being held for ransom. That's certainly one way of looking at it. On occasion, really good fossils do arise, and they're on the market for quite some time because the asking price is so high. So an example of this is the dueling dinosaurs, which is a associated Tyrannosaur and Ceratopsian. It's been on the market for quite some time. It's also been bound up in litigation. But my impression is that it is currently on the market, but the point here is that specimens like that, really nice ones, people want a high price for them, and either museums can pony up or they can't, and so these specimens are vulnerable to being taken up by private individuals who have the means. Museums aren't that wealthy. They can't go around buying up multi-million-dollar fossils. It's just impossible. Their budgets aren't that high, and with that kind of money, you could build a new gallery or do more useful things with it. So, so we're in a tough situation, and there's no end in sight to this issue at the current time. That is, nice fossils being put up on offer for exorbitant rates. So it's not a great position that we're currently in. But to return to your question, yes, museums can and do buy fossils. That brings them within the public trust. In and of itself, that sort of purchase is not unethical. So when it comes to T.rex, the effect of the commercial trade has been pretty serious. I keep a running list of T.rexes that are privately held. That includes specimens that are in private collections or specimens that are for sale. And there are at least 15 good T.rex specimens out there that are in private hands. And that not only includes adults, but that includes subadults and juveniles. So in terms of our understanding of T.rex, there is a real cost in terms of the science. If all those specimens were in museums, then they would be studied. They would make their way into literature. They contribute to the body of knowledge of T.rex, the evolution of that animal, its growth, and so on. And so it's not just academic. This isn't theoretical. When push comes to shove, science is really compromised by specimens that are simply inaccessible to scientists. And if I were to say, well, to hell with it, I'm going to go and study these specimens regardless, I would be, violating the ethics of my own profession. And I'm certainly not willing to do that. That's something that wouldn't even cross my mind. But it really puts us scientists at a disadvantage when specimens are privately held, because that's a lot of information that's simply inaccessible. We could learn a lot, but we can't. Our hands are tied.
This is very
And they're
important.
tied for good reason, though.
Yeah, of course. I mean, all of this, however frustrating it is, it's not happening without a good reason, because I'm 100% certain where it's very, very easy to just go in and take all these notes and all the necessary studies and perform all the necessary processes to record all this information, useful information, mind you, as well, which you correctly pointed out. I'm pretty sure it would have already been done a long time ago if it was really that easy and possible. So there is a reason to everything. So I wanted to then perhaps just transition into this, just bringing up some of the more notable specimens. Since I mean, is there anything else
Sure.
that you wanted to touch up and add to my viewers and myself regarding to what particular section of this code of ethics that we should look for when we're, for example, if we were to look at certain material being presented, whether it's documentaries or whether it's a book or maybe something else, how, in order to understand how these claims are being generated and made. Because if somebody basically publishes a study or a material which would be based on the knowledge acquired from these specimens, how should us public perceive it? How would that affect us if it does, if it affects us at all? Like, what would be your understand how it affects the scientific community? But I want to obviously clear out the points of how it could affect the public perception and how should we go about our research, whether it's affected or not in that regard. Does it make sense?
So I think the main takeaway for your listeners and for the public in general is to recall from the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where young Indiana Jones, upon seeing an artifact being stolen, exclaims, "That belongs in a museum." And I think what the public should know is that ethic, that basic ethic, does have teeth in terms of the ethics of the science of vertebrate paleontology and science in general, is that that our ethics are there to protect the integrity of the science, to ensure that specimens do make it into museums where they can be studied. I think it's important for the public to recognize that there is a difference between a fossil in a museum and, say, a fossil in a rock shop or at a gem and mineral show. These are two completely different realms, the commercial realm and the museum realm, that the fossils that are offered for sale are outside of the bounds of science, and only if those fossils make their way to a museum will they ever contribute to science.
Right, sure. If I were as a, say, let's just say as somebody who genuinely interested in researching paleontology and bringing this to my viewers, for me also it would be better, to also use and cite the knowledge and material that is being collected from these specimens, which are not privately owned but are actually in the hands of the accredited bodies. Right? So basically, it's better for me to also refer to the studies which use those material as a reference.
Yeah, I mean, the ethics certainly don't necessarily, well, they don't extend to the public at large, but but I do recommend people sort of use it as a guideline, as you've just described. I think that's reasonable. Just for example, just in terms of daily practice for me, if someone like from the general public wants to discuss, a T-Rex with me, or Tyrannosaurs, and they want to bring in privately owned specimens, I won't discuss them. They're simply not on the table for me to consider. And I think that's something. So that's where the ethics in my conduct rub up against my interactions with the public, and I'll just say, flat out, no, I will not discuss that specimen. I don't have anything to say about it because it's not in a museum. And, I might be an outlier among my colleagues. Some of my colleagues might not have a problem discussing, say, an image of a privately owned specimen, but I won't do it. That's a line I won't cross because I don't want to validate the private ownership of fossils or the commercial sale of fossils outside of science. So I won't cross that line.
Okay, so of course this means that obviously some of these matters can be subject to opinion, but there is a general kind of path that is advised to follow, especially for those who aim to get into paleontology as a profession for the future.
Yep, that, and also just the interested public. If you want to chat, with me about T.rex, I won't discuss any of the privately owned ones at all. And I think it's helpful for the public to know why I won't do that. I'm not being, I'm not trying to be a jerk. I'm just trying to, follow the standard of my profession and validating, and I won't validate privately owned specimens. That's just something I can't bring myself to do because it's ultimately against the interests of science. And to validate those specimens ignores that ethic and just doesn't help the situation.
Like, if you remember, I don't remember what year exactly that was made in. I think it was either early 2000s or somewhere even in the 90s. There was this, one of the adaptation of The Lost World that had Professor Challenger portrayed by John Rhys Davies. He's the same actor who plays Gimli in Lord of the Rings, by the way.
Oh, yes.
You remember this one? And
I haven't seen it.
All right. Yeah, if you want to, just for the entertainment's sake, watch it just to see at least how the scientists are being portrayed in the film. It's just quite a lot of fun. It's got quite a bit of a comic relief to it from time to time, but really great acting overall. And his character Challenger said something very nice, like, "In the name of science, my dear professor, in the name of science, So in the name of science, we always stick to the, certain principles as well, because some of the rules I could almost by inertia almost said unwritten, but actually that would be wrong because they are written right here on the screen. So and yes, by the way, I do want to talk about T.rex, Dr. Carr, and this brings me to my next question. Are you ready for this?
Yep.
So what can you tell us in general terms about the type specimen from the Carnegie Museum? Because I believe, although everybody knows about this specimen, but for some reason we haven't even actually discussed it very much at all, in fact, in our previous session. So at least briefly, or some important points and interesting pieces of information that you could bring up about this particular specimen and its importance to the fossil record and knowledge of Tyrannosaurus in general. So microphone over to you now.
Sure. Well, the type specimen, that's the name-bearing specimen of T.rex, is in the collections of the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. It was originally in the collections of the American Museum of Natural History, but it was transferred to the Carnegie. I think that it was exchanged for some other fossils. So some fossils from the Carnegie left for New York, and the type went to the Carnegie. This was during wartime, but there's a bit of a story behind that. But the cool thing about the type specimen is it's a nicely preserved specimen, and it certainly isn't complete. The skull has the maxillae, an ectopterygoid, squamosal, lower jaws, and there's a partial vertebral column. The hind limbs are pretty much all there, except the feet aren't complete. The tail's not complete, but there's quite a bit of it. There's also gastralia and a humerus and some other bits and pieces. So it's not the most complete T-Rex ever found, but at the time it was certainly one of the more complete large theropods found at the time. T-Rex was named based on this specimen by Henry Fairfield Osborn in 1905, and one of its diagnostic features was its great size. So T-Rex back then and now is distinguished by its great size. Certainly it has a couple of challengers, but even among Tyrannosaurids, T-Rex is still sort of the champion in terms of body size, and that's based on the length of the femur, so it's about 1.3 meters in length. A stupendously large theropod by any measure. The type specimen included the humerus, as I mentioned, and Osborn wasn't entirely sure if the humerus actually belonged to this giant theropod, and he did express his doubts, but he did make the right call that the humerus does belong, this tiny arm bone does belong with this gigantic animal. And that hypothesis was redeemed in 1914 through the discovery of the type specimen of what was then called Gorgosaurus libratus, now Albertosaurus libratus. And the type specimen of libratus is a gorgeous skeleton. It's nearly complete. It's just missing the tip of the tail, effectively, and some neck vertebrae. But the cool thing about that type specimen is that it included at least one complete arm and hand in articulation, clearly showing that Tyrannosaurs indeed had very short and stumpy humeri and short front limbs, for that matter. So that redeems Osborn's observation, which I'm pretty sure he did comment on in 1916 when he did a more thorough description of the skeleton of the type specimen. I think that your listeners can find those original publications online. I think they are in PDF format through the American Museum Library. So it was published through American Museum publications, so I'm sure they'd be archived there.
Right. So I wanted to quickly also ask if you can please remind where that type specimen of, back then Gorgosaurus, but now Albertosaurus libratus is currently being held. Which collection does it belong to?
Yeah, it's in the collections of the Canadian Museum of Nature, and it's currently, since it's a type specimen, it's in collections, so it's accessible for research. So it's in Ottawa, Canada.
Okay, lovely. So that's one of the reasons to visit that museum at the very least. Will be worth the travel. And speaking of traveling, I presume this is the upcoming weekend. We will be seeing you off to the Museum of the Rockies. Is that right?
Yes. I'm working on a monograph on Deposition horneri, and there's some loose threads for me to tie up. Some description of the adult specimen. We had some additional bones prepared, including the brain case, so I have to include that. And I also have a whole bunch of line drawings to do that I have to work on. During my last visit, I spent the first week revising the manuscript for the Deposition horneri article that was published last year in March. And then at the end of the first week, I broke my leg. I broke my foot off my leg, skeleton. I slipped in the stairwell. And so I didn't get quite that much done in the last 2 weeks. So hopefully I will not break my other leg this time around, and I'll actually get some work done.
Yeah, that is basically raising a glass not to breaking any limbs,
Yeah.
because that would be quite problematic to do anything at that point. So yes, good stuff. I mean, I'm certainly interested to know what sort of information we would hope to expect on the outcome. So, how long would you roughly be looking at spending your time in the Museum of the Rockies on that trip?
Um, well, I'd be in there basically every day that I can manage. So, Monday to Friday, business hours, and and it's pretty intense and solitary. So just for your listeners to get the idea of what research on Tyrannosaurus is like, effectively I'm sitting for hours upon hours in a museum collection with either a fossil on a pallet or a fossil on the table, and taking measurements, writing descriptions, taking photographs, taking measurements. It's a fairly systematic process, but it's very labor intensive, and it's definitely an arduous but worthwhile pursuit. But it takes a lot of work to produce, say, a description of a fossil. It's certainly something that you just don't whip off in an afternoon. This project has been ongoing for quite some time. I'm sure I've logged in at least a couple of months on this project. So
I was
I
wondering
just
as well, how many cups of coffee would it take you per day to keep it going?
it takes several. It's coffee in the afternoon and one energy drink. And sorry, let me restate that. At least a couple cups of coffee in the morning and at least one energy drink. Not more than one, but just one energy drink in the afternoon just to get through that 2 o'clock lull.
Alrighty, so that means, well, the viewers who decide to do extensive study of fossils, like Dr. Tom Carr, they take notes.
Yeah,
Alrighty.
and actually I'm sort of glad that you asked that because I teach a course on dinosaur evolution at Carthage College, and I've actually I've drafted a textbook for the course, and part of that textbook is to instruct students on how to actually describe a specimen, and by walking them through how to approach a bone, it might be bewildering. As a student, I remember the first time I wrote up a fossil, it was a young Albertosaurus libratus skull, and the first bone I pulled out of the shelf was a maxilla, the upper jaw bone, and in the first minute or at the start, I just didn't know where to start. And so my textbook in part aims to help students over that hump, just how to get traction on writing up a bone, because there's a lot of structure. It can be overwhelming. But I don't imagine this textbook will be available anytime soon. It's still in progress. And I have a lot of other projects ahead of it too.
Would you be able to give a rough estimate of the current work in progress that you have right now in regards to the Tyrannosaurid ontogeny that we have discussed back in the previous session? How long do you think a project like this will take you to complete, and when it will become available for pre-order?
Yeah, the Jane monograph. I'm still in the midst of wrapping up the comparative plates, showing growth series of each bone, so people can follow the text, the changes I described there. I also have to do the table of contents and index a lot of sort of routine, intensive, kind of boring stuff too. So I imagine that the manuscript will not be done till the summer, realistically. And then beyond that, it might be relatively quick in terms of publication. That might be, a year after it's done. So we're looking at 2019, 2020.
Okay, so it's not basically 5 years or 10 years time. It's basically fairly short proximity in relative terms speaking.
Relatively, yeah. It's further than I prefer. It's a lot of work. People will see that. It'll be a thick book, um, but worthwhile, I think. You know,
Would you also be kind to remind us as well what, if you can, of course, remember straight from the head, which specimens of Tyrannosaurus or just generally Tyrannosaurids would be uh, mentioned and addressed as part of the study throughout the publication in this book?
yeah. So the focus, the centerpiece specimen is Jane, which is a subadult T-Rex that's on display and in the collections of the Burpee Museum of Natural History in Rockford, Illinois. So Jane's a centerpiece, but the entire work describes Jane in the context of growth. So there's a lot of mention of description of the type specimen. I go out of my way to include the type specimen where I can, since it is a type and ought to be, receive that sort of attention. I also include the Cleveland skull, which is a less mature T-Rex skull. It's in the collections of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And last June, I went to the Cleveland Museum to take a second look at it, just to fill out some missing parts from the monograph. So there's quite a variety of specimens. So Cleveland skull, Jane, the type, specimens from the Museum of the Rockies, including t.rex, which is an adult skull and skeleton, which is on display. People can go and see t.rex in the public galleries at the Museum of the Rockies. So it's has pretty substantial coverage.
Yeah,
I'll
it's
put it
already
that way.
quite a volume to go because, like you said, that even single specimen description in detail takes up quite a lot of quote unquote space as far as the text goes as well. And I wanted to also add, we did mention specimens both in this session and a previous session. And in the previous session, we also briefly touched up on Scotty in Canada. Will these
Yeah.
specimens also, by any chance, make appearance in the publication?
Oh yeah, Scotty is central.
Oh,
I would say it's among the adults, I think, especially for the skull. Scotty, I think, is the main point of reference. So where the type specimen can't provide information, I lean heavily on Scotty, t.rex, and MR 555, and of course, AMNH 5027, the really nice T-Rex that's at the American Museum. So those are, in terms of the adults, those are the main ones. I also include the LA adult, but Scotty is pretty important. And part of the reason for that is, I've spent, I think, at least a couple weeks with it, so I have a pretty good data set for it, a fairly complete data set.
it would be
So yeah,
quite
Scotty's
exciting.
important. Sorry?
Yeah, oh, sorry that way because sometimes when I mistakenly think that you're about to finish the thoughts, I jump in to make some in between comments. But anyway, my main comment was that it would be really exciting to see this specimen in particular being more detailed, in terms of the research, because we don't have quite a lot of good publications on it, and it's just I find such a significant specimen to be highly underrated and not mentioned a lot among the discussions when it comes to Tyrannosaurus, even in particular. And I recall last session you said that it was an adult, but on a more younger spectrum rather than a more mature spectrum. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was less mature than I expected. It's still a fully fledged adult. It's not as mature as, say, the specimen in Los Angeles, the full adult that's there. It's sort of, yeah, it's fairly youthful. And that surprised me. And that's based on a quantitative analysis, which will be published separately. So in the monograph, I block out T-Rex growth in terms of juvenile, subadult, and adult. So sort of it's mainly three main growth stages, sometimes four, where or more where it's appropriate. So it's a pretty good overview of growth in T-Rex, but I don't get into the weeds in terms of the fine differences in growth in the monograph. That's being saved for a shorter article that's based on a quantitative analysis of all those features.
Sure.
And so in that work, I can actually give a more exact assessment of Scotty's maturity relative to, say, the New York skull or Pex Rex.
Okay, that's good to hear. May I also ask you if obviously it's possible to verify whether the type specimen, where does it fit in terms of the age group? Like, is it a young adult? Is it a fully mature adult, or is it like an elder? How does it basically fit? Is it actually even possible to verify that data based on the specimen preservation, or does that specimen not tell us that information?
It does. I mean, depending on the bone, I can assess the relative maturity of a single bone, and I actually have a couple specimens like that in the data set. But to answer your question, the type specimen is an old adult. It's not a young adult, and so there are several features that do position it as more mature than, say, the New York specimen or even Pex Rex. I think it might be more, if I recall correctly, it's more mature than Pex Rex, which is relatively young, like Scotty, despite its large size. And that's one upshot, is that size doesn't really mean anything in terms of maturity beyond a certain point. All the big Rexes are roughly the same size, but that doesn't mean they're the same maturity. And so you can't peg chronological age on size alone. You actually do have to have the histology, to provide that number. Yeah.
So one other specimen, this is actually not a T-Rex. This time I wanted to bring up, which I feel like it's not discussed frequently, and probably there are right reasons for it, which we might explore shortly. But
Sure.
it's nevertheless something that I find very intriguing and might be potentially useful for those who might want to get into understanding it better and for the purpose of the reconstruction. Is the genus and the species also subsequently identified as Zhuchengtyrannus magnus? Now,
Yes.
what can we really verify in terms of what is known from it, and how can we truly reconstruct this animal based on the information provided, given how much information do we have? Let's establish that first, and then we'll go further if it's possible.
Well, there's right now, what's been published are only two bones, so a maxilla and a dentary. And I hope that more pieces are found. So that isn't much to go on. But those bones are more similar to Tyrannosaurus batar and Tyrannosaurus rex than they are to the other Tyrannosaurids. So it doesn't look like, it's not similar to Deposition, for example, or to Albertosaurus or any of the others. So my expectation is that, that Zhuchengtyrannus probably looked like a small T-Rex. And the reason why I say Rex and not Batar is that Batar is kind of weird in a couple ways, which are unique. And T-Rex is a bit more generic, believe it or not, in terms of certain features in the skull. So I'd expect Zhucheng to look like a small T-Rex. So we're still talking about an animal that's at least 30 feet long, but...
Fair enough. So basically, obviously, we're facing a problem of a limited fossil data, basically, and specifically the most problematic area to reconstruct would be the top parts of the skull, like the eyebrow sockets, which we don't know what they look like, if it had any specific features maybe, or the nasal horns, I believe, because the maxilla and dentary parts only tell us something about its teeth, I presume, right? Because the teeth were preserved as well, weren't they?
Yeah, teeth are preserved, and well, I think there's a couple ways of approaching this. And the first is that on the face of it, Zhucheng Tyrannus, isn't different from Batara Rex all that much. And so it would be reasonable to reconstruct its skull based on, as I just said, as to reconstruct it based on Rex. That would be the prediction. Yeah, I did say there's a couple ways of approaching it. I think really there's only one.
Yeah, I was gonna say that it's a
It's
tricky
a very
one.
limited data set, and as that's as limited as it gets. It's better than having one tooth,
Sure.
which some dinosaurs are based on. But it's just this is just life for vertebrate paleontology. You don't always find a complete skeleton on the first go, and right now it's just a matter of time before additional material is found. Zhucheng Tyrannus is from a quarry that's very productive in terms of many different types of dinosaurs, and it's just inevitable that additional Tyrannosaurid material will be found if it hasn't happened already. But that's my prediction, is that it'll look like Rex. The rest of the parts will. And
Would that by any chance imply that it might even start showing some transitional, changes in evolution of how the binocular vision kind of, the forward-facing eyes, for example, where the T-Rex can implement, making it quite unique, yeah? That could potentially be an intermediate sort of stage, or maybe perhaps it has already reached it. So obviously that part of the skull is unknown, but based on your expectation, do you think this is something that we would hope to be able to resolve by the time we find a complete Zhucheng Tyrannus skull?
yeah, I'd expect to see that. And the thing is with T-Rex and its orbital fenestrae, they don't face entirely forwards. They face pretty much as much forward as they do to the side. So it isn't, like car headlights that face forward, or like a dog where the eyes face completely forward. There still is a lateral component to the fenestrae, and that's also the case in Batar. But with animals like Deposition, the eyes are pretty much looking off to the side. They almost look like a horse, where the fenestra faces more to the side. There's hardly any forward component at all. And that's a primitive condition for Tyrannosaurus. And so I'd expect, my naive prediction would be that Zhucheng would have a slight rostral component, that slight binocular vision. That remains to be seen. Maybe the forward-facing orbits are only in Batar and Rex, but we won't know until more fossils are found.
Even in case of Batar, if we were to look at the skulls from the top view, you can see how much narrower it is, and it's slightly even, even in Batar, it is still somewhat visible, but it's still more prominent in the Rex, though, I would say, at least based on my observation, but my obviously knowledge of skeletal and terminology and how it's all, just the general structure of it could be obviously very limited. Correct me if I'm wrong, but given the narrow, obviously, structure of the Batar skull, it's still only showing perhaps a more or less like a transition. Words are difficult, aren't they? The transitional status of the whole thing, finally. Is that right?
Yeah, it's fair. There is I think it's fair to say that there is a transition that Rex is the most extreme. Some of that is an optical illusion, though. The back of the skull is really wide in Rex, and the snout's narrow. And That difference is less extreme in Batar. But even then, the orbital fenestrae aren't rotated entirely forward. There's still a bit of a side orientation to them. And that doesn't mean that binocular vision was absent. It's just not like headlights. As I said, it's not like headlights in a car.
And wanted to ask you, have you by any chance visited the collection in the museum in Moscow that has, I believe, it has a multiple specimens of Tarbosaurus or Tyrannosaurus batar. Have you had any chance to deal with them at all, or have you not had your hands on them yet?
I haven't seen them first. Oh, I've seen one specimen, what became the type of Tarbosaurus ephraimovi, did travel. It was actually in Toronto as part of a Mongolian-Russian dinosaurs exhibit that was featured there, and I spent quite a few nights with that skull. It's basically, you can only see the left side of it, but it's a gorgeous specimen, absolutely beautiful. I spent about a week with it. I created real headaches for the security team at the Royal Ontario Museum to let me in after hours, with the permission of the Russians, of course. So I have a very good data set for that animal. I have not been to Moscow. They have a very important collection. They have a growth series of Batar. They also have the type specimen, which incidentally, the type name of Tyrannosaurus batar is Tyrannosaurus batar, and the name Tarbosaurus came along some years later. It was named back in 1955. But regardless, it's an important collection. They have a juvenile, a subadult. They have several adults. And yeah, that's a collection that's at the top of my list.
So speaking of the list, can we summarize quickly, because we're probably reaching towards the end of this part, and
Yes.
just wanted to ask, what would be your top three picks of the collections that you would like to visit in the world?
Um, Moscow, because the type of Tyrannosaurus batar is there. So it's very important to anchor our work on type specimens and growth series. So Moscow for both reasons. Also the type specimen of Ailoramus remotus is there, which is a fairly mature specimen of Ailoramus. Just trying to think. This should be easy for me. See, I've seen just about everything in North America, so we can exclude that. I've seen material in London. I like to see Aviatyrannus. There's a pretty good ilium, partial ischium of that animal from Portugal. I think that's very important to see.
One more left?
I know. Sorry. The one that I'm really itching to see is Xiangguanlong, which is this long-snouted tyrannosaur from China. And it's basically, in my view, among the basket of basal tyrannosaurs, it's the only one that actually looks like a tyrannosaur to me. So to my eye, animals like Dilong, Guanlong, Yutyrannus, Prostratosaurus, they don't look like tyrannosaurids, but Xiangguanlong does. And I think it's for that reason, its phylogenetic position and its geological age, I think it's very important, and it's one I haven't seen firsthand. So of the basal ones, that's at the top of my list, definitely.
So for this Shan Guanlong, what this could potentially provide us is, well, which family it belongs to, perhaps. Like, do we actually have any allocation of specific family that it belongs to, or is it just like a quote unquote free roaming among the tree on its own? What's this?
It's pretty stable. So if memory serves, it's between things like Dilong and Appalachiosaurus. So it's a tyrannosaurid line tyrannosaur. and it's the basalmost one. It's even though it's not perfectly preserved, it's somewhat crushed from top to bottom. But it's definitely a Tyrannosaurid line Tyrannosauroid. And so to my mind, it really stands out for that reason. And it's one that I haven't seen firsthand. I've only seen photographs. And I just think I would learn a lot about the morphology of a true basal Tyrannosaurid from that specimen more than the others.
So, does this mean that this specimen is actually a Tyrannosaurida, or is it still outside of the Tyrannosaurida family?
It's definitely outside, so it's several steps out.
Right. Okay. So there's still obviously gonna be quite a few steps between before it gets to the main, like to the Tyrannosaurida family, as we know it, basically.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll certainly be looking out for that. Well, I guess lastly, we'll just try to relax from all this, intense learning process and remind our viewers, Dr. Carr, why are dinosaurs awesome?
They're awesome because they're direct evidence for evolution and the longevity of the planet. And they put our place on this in the universe with some clarity, is that we're one little tiny branch on the great tree of life. We haven't been around that long, and so I think that there's an important existential lesson to be drawn, not just from dinosaurs, but from the whole fossil record. So I think that's why they're awesome. They put us in our place. That's what they do.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say that's basically what you would probably use the perfect phrase to just nail it. It's just they just put us back in our place. They just
Yep.
they just remind us that they are basically more awesome than us, and I think that could potentially disrespect some humans.
Well, yeah, and our effect on the planet is utterly disproportionate to the amount of time we've been on it. In less than 10,000 years, our effect on the planet has been really destructive, and hopefully we can turn that around.
Yeah, let's hope for the best. I mean, we are not giving up just yet. Fight. Let's just say the fight is not over. All right. Well, I certainly think there has been quite a lot of interesting and important points we have brought up to this discussion. And despite the lengthy nature of the video, I believe this should serve its purpose to educate, both educational and just certain, opening up certain aspects that many of you, my dear viewers and subscribers, have not been aware of and have not considered, perhaps. So by the end of this session, you should know how, where to look for and how to use this guidance for the ethics when it comes to those who want to get into paleontology. And this should also give you an understanding, an idea why it's important to, where possible and mostly preferable, to cite material that does not belong to private owners and is mostly out there belonging to the museum's collections. So also we have covered some nice specimens and quite a brief overview of them as well, and some more updates on Dr. Carr's current work, which will be hopefully published sooner than later. And I hope that once first news hits the shelves, we can obviously start hitting and spamming that pre-order button. So, what are your closure thoughts, Dr. Carr, before we obviously wish our viewers all the best, and before obviously I let you go?
So, in summary, the ethics are there for a reason. They're there to protect the science, and the specimens are central to that. think it's really helpful for people to think of museums as libraries, and the books are the fossils. And in order for us to learn anything from the libraries, the fossils have to be there. So I think as a scientist, it's better for fossils to be in museums and university collections, those sorts of places, than say in a private collection somewhere, which is inaccessible to science. So I just want people to keep that in mind. And that protects the integrity of the science because it's all based on information at the end of the day. But I just want to thank you very much for having me back again, and I hope that this has been illuminating for some and entertaining for others.
Certainly, you're very welcome, and I'm really happy that you have managed to come to my channel again with such a short notice and just prior to your much anticipated trip, which is not always too easy to make arrangement, when you're just about preparing and just all the craziness probably going prior to that as well. I can very much appreciate it. I'm sure my viewers will appreciate it just as much, and I am hoping that's definitely not the last session we have on the channel. I am definitely hoping that aside from obviously this session being a bit more focused on certain, let's just say, specific type of material here that we covered, it will just provide a very useful tool for my viewers as well, and for myself as well, actually, come to think of it. So all the thanks from the bottom of my heart. I can probably bravely speak on behalf of my viewers and subscribers that they are very grateful for you to come here as well. We would like to wish you a safe trip to Museum of the Rockies, and
Thank you.
We would also like to wish you, lots of fun and interesting discoveries that you may have when you get your hands on all these lovely jubbly specimens. And
Yes.
I'm pretty sure you're looking forward to that already. Like,
Yeah.
I can almost hear you rubbing your hands together like that. Like, yeah, definitely. Just get me there already. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so yes, I mean, thank you guys very much for watching and enduring this hour with us. And I've been t.rex, and we've had Dr. Thomas Carr. Thank you very much for watching, and I will definitely see you in the next video. Please hit this like button, subscribe, and share. And thank you once again, Dr. Thomas Carr, for coming here.
Thanks for having me back.
Lovely, jubbly. And that concludes our session. Bye bye, everybody, and I will see you soon.